And hello, everybody. Welcome to A Narrative on a Tuesday evening. So good to be with you tonight. And we've got an exciting show tonight. It's all haywire as before we get on the air, as always, but it's so nice to be with everyone tonight. Hello to Dave Troy. Nice to see you, Dave. How are you? Thanks for being here.
I'm doing well. It's great to be back here with you, Zev, and the rest of our guests.
It's so nice to have you here. And Aaron Harris, who many of you know is clearing _fog or clearing the fog. How are you, Aaron?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being here. And Joe Dempsey's back. Dempsey too, who's with us tonight as well. How are you, Joe?
Good, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So excited about tonight because we really wanted to talk about what happened last week, which was, we had an interview with Everett Stern, who is a GOP Senate candidate for the GOP in Philadelphia, who came out swinging with some real allegations against Michael Flynn, saying that he and his cohorts have been extorting local officials, attempting to use blackmail and a bunch of other things to try and get them to support the audit. It was pretty stunning to have that kind of first-person allegation on our air. So I wanted to get, the trust of brains that we have on Twitter to discuss this a little bit and figure out what we learned from that. From that, we have all the new subpoenas that came out from the January 6th committee. So we want to discuss that. And when you look at all of the totality, it really is beginning to give us a different view of what January 6th was all about. I mean, we all know what happened on the day. We all saw it in real time. But it seems that the campaign to get it done, the campaign to organize all these people, the militias, the political undertaking, and now it seems even maybe some of the dirty tricks that went on in order to coerce people to get involved in January 6th is much greater than just that day, and certainly much greater than has previously been reported. So that's what we're going to talk about in general today. But I wanted to first get your thoughts, Dave, if we could start with you, about the new wave of subpoenas that came out. We had 6 last night, another 10 today. We'll go through all the names in general in just a bit, or in detail in just a bit. But generally, what do you think is going on with the committee's requests for these documents and this evidence?
Sure. So I think that, it's pretty good indication that they're getting to the right people and are starting to get good information about, who is responsible for this, who has more information, and, generally what direction to take the investigation. And so I'm pretty encouraged to see the people that they've pulled in. Yesterday they announced that they were bringing in Michael Flynn, who, many of us who have been studying this believe him to be very much at the center of a lot of this activity. And then also Bernie Carrick, who is apparently responsible for coordinating a lot of the logistics of the kind of war rooms and hotel accommodations and whatnot that these guys were using during the January 6th event. And of course, he's an old, tight friend with Rudy Giuliani and all of that. So it was good to see that. And then today, Stephen Miller and, a variety of other folks, including Kayleigh McEnany, former press secretary, and a variety of John McEntee was another big presidential advisor who was sort of his body man prior to becoming a more active advisor. So they're getting to the right people now. There's been some discussion as to whether or not these subpoenas are going to be enforced and what the consequences will be for not showing up, and whether these people are going to be cooperative or not. And I think those are valid questions, but I also think we want to not jump to conclusions about how this is going to play out. If we see that there's a pattern of failure to comply with these subpoenas and to be cooperative, that's indicative of a criminal conspiracy, and that's the sort of thing that popular pressure can help to put more sunlight onto this, so that we really do get to the bottom of it. But I would also caution that that this kind of a committee, I mean, it's not a law enforcement exercise. It's a political committee designed to elicit a certain kind of political analysis and outcome, and it's also on a bit of a tight schedule too. It needs to kind of do that sometime next year prior to the midterms functionally. So right. I think those are kind of the factors that are at play, but it's great to see the progress that they're making.
They have made some good progress. Let's begin, if we don't mind, looking at a little bit in detail here before the others jump in. So there's, I think particularly interesting to me was Keith Kellogg, who's the National Security Advisor to VP Pence. Now, he was amongst the subpoenas handed out today. And it is interesting here that he was at the White House with former President Trump on January the 6th as the attack on the U.S. Capitol unfolded. And he has direct information, according to the committee, about the former president's statements about and reactions to the Capitol insurrection. According to several accounts during the day, Kellogg met Mr. Trump and others before the rally at the Ellipse, and then after the rally, reportedly urged Mr. Trump to send out a tweet to supporters at the U.S. Capitol to help control the crowd. Now, of course, Trump didn't do this. There were many, many requests on that day. He ultimately did put out some sort of tweets, but it certainly wasn't as quickly or as directly as many of the people around him were asking. It seems to me that that's what a lot of today's subpoenas were about. It seems to be about making sure that people understand that there were many people around Donald Trump saying, do something, and that he chose not to do that, what they were asking. In fact, kept watching TV and encouraging the event. Aaron, what do you think of all of that?
I agree. I also, agree with Dave's point that it's important to distinguish, the difference between a criminal investigation and a public investigation like this, a political investigation. Mm-hmm. I refer to it more as public, but, criminal investigations are very narrow and limited in scope, in the way that they fact find. They only look for information and only report out information that pertains specifically to criminal activities and activities that fall under criminal statutes. And so the reason it's important is criminal investigations like that don't ever actually paint a full story. They don't tell a full story or paint a full picture about, especially with an event as large as this and as complex as this. It's really important to do both, right? I mean, obviously we need criminal accountability where crimes were committed, but we also need to see the entire story and kind of paint the picture of what happened that day from beginning to end, even going back, as we've seen, even going back previous to January 6th and going back and investigating all the conversations that were had much before. In fact, one of the committee subpoenas goes back as early as April 2020. So, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to add one more thing is that I was also interested today in the subpoena of Ben Williamson and Christopher Liddell, because Zach Cohen with CNN shared a story earlier today, and I wasn't really familiar with those two people.
Those are new names to me. I don't really know very much about them, but I did look a little into them today. What did they say on CNN that was interesting to you?
What was interesting is that they are both really close to Mark Meadows, and as we know, the committee subpoenaed Mark Meadows some time ago, and he hasn't exactly been forthcoming, and the reporting is that they're getting a little frustrated with Mark Meadows' cooperation so far, and so it's really interesting. It almost seems like this is kind of a strategy to get to the information they were hoping to get from Meadows in a different way.
It does seem to me that's in fact exactly what they were trying to do. Looking at the letters that they sent out to these, relatively unknown people, it seems that in one case they want to know, why Meadows didn't react to a call from the press department there to do something to condemn the violence. That's why they want to talk to Ben Williamson. They also want to talk to Chris Liddell, much for the same kind of reasons. They want to know what Meadows did in the weeks leading up to the insurrection. So you're absolutely right that that's one of the things that they're trying to do there, is trying to get some more information about that. They're also trying to get information about Mike Pence. Not so much questioning Mike Pence, but looking at the pressure campaign that Donald Trump and others had to try and convince Mike Pence to do, the seemingly illegal, which would have been to overturn the election results. Joe, do you have any thoughts about how that is all developing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Pence is an anomaly for me in some ways because, he's still sort of, backing Trump. He's, still kind of on the team, but there's some things that are coming out. I don't know if you saw, I think it was Mueller, she wrote, had an exclusive, I believe, today, talking about how the badges on the security detail and for Mike Pence just didn't work on January 6th at some point during the day.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
It is interesting because as they're trying to, save, Pence or, make him safe, I think one of the other things is there's a story about how, Pence was supposed to get into a vehicle and he said, I'm not getting into that vehicle. So one of the things that he sort of did to help kind of save the day, if you will, was stay at the Capitol, which, you kind of have to look at and say that's above all of this in a way, in the sense that if he had left, they didn't have to do anything to harm him. All they had to do was keep him away from the Capitol and keep him away from certifying the election.
Mhm.
And the more time that went on in terms of, just that length of time that Pence was unavailable to do the certification, who knows what could have happened in that, what they could have done to sort of quote unquote keep Pence safe. They could have called in, troops, or they could have done, any number of things. But Darren's point about Mark Meadows, I feel in a way that he's sort of the fulcrum in a lot of this. There was a report, I believe, in the Washington Post recently. They did a 3-part series called Before, During, and After.
Mhm.
And they went about 120 or so days prior to the election and started talking about, what was going on. And then they would bring it down. They'd say like 63 days before the inauguration, those kind of things. And then they did during, and then they did after. One of the things that was interesting was Mark Meadows going back and forth between, trying to get Trump to, put out a message and what to say, and bringing even Ivanka in to try to, get her father to, stop what was going on. And Meadows, it was told, was sort of speaking out of both sides of his mouth in terms of, being a yes man to Trump, but then also kind of going to Ivanka and saying, he's got to stop this. You got to get in front of this.
It's interesting, just to circle back a little bit with Pence there, that I had heard as well that they couldn't get into the safe room because they didn't have the safe keys for the safe room for Pence at the Capitol. Is that along the lines of what Allison is reporting? That's really interesting.
I think that's what the badge is not working about.
Okay, I see. Okay, so that's not a news story, but she probably has new details on that. The other interesting name that comes up, and it's impossible to ignore this guy because he's so loathsome, is Stephen Miller. I mean, there is no nastier person in the entire administration. It's really easy to dislike the guy. And here he is involved in everything going around January 6th. According to the committee, he says, and this is pretty long here, but I'll just cut it down to the important stuff, that the Select Committee's investigation and public accounts have revealed credible evidence of your involvement in the events within the scope of the committee's inquiry. Based on our public statements, you were aware and participated in efforts to spread false information about alleged voter fraud on the November 2020 election, as well as efforts to encourage state legislatures to alter the outcome of November 2020 by, among other things, appointing alternate state of electors and sent competing electoral votes to the United States Congress. So, and then it also talks about him helping to write the speech for the Stop the Steal rally, and he was also with Mr. Trump that whole day. Now, this guy, Stephen Miller, seems to be a constant, I don't know how you would describe him, just a constant irritant in the Trump White House. Dave, this new information is not particularly new, but the fact that he's got such a big role to play with all of this is not surprising, but it is nevertheless disturbing because of the kind of person he is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were sort of an original batch of, very incendiary people that were brought into the mix in the early days of the administration, and he was certainly one of them, and somebody that I think, kind of trained at the right hand of Bannon in terms of being able to find divisive issues, package language around those issues, and get people really, divided and wound up around certain issues. That was I believe he was a Duke alumni and, was stirring up a lot of stuff there, and then worked for Jeff Sessions some. So, he's a talented provocateur. And I think that that's kind of what's at the core of a lot of this is, the desire to provoke people and to create divisions. And in those divisions, really sow chaos that can then be bent into different outcomes. And I think that that's what a lot of what the purpose of January 6th was to generate enough chaos that multiple outcomes were possible.
It seems to me that the one thing that we haven't paid as much attention to, and this is really what I want to focus on in tonight's show, is this attempt to convince local officials, state officials around the country, to change their votes and thinking around the slate of electors that they were sending, and convincing the GOP on a federal level to back this idea that we needed to, audit all the elections or rerun the elections, which is really an idea that came from Michael Flynn. But is the core thing that led up to January the 6th. I mean, January the 6th was a terrible event on its own, but there was a huge campaign. And it seems that Stephen Miller was among the people involved in doing that. We certainly know Mark Meadows was involved in doing that, because we also have that phone call with Donald Trump and the election officials out of Georgia. But the more I look at this, the more I think that, we haven't really investigated enough of what Mike Flynn and his cohorts have been doing. So, it might be instructive to talk a little bit first about Flynn's own subpoena here, which came out of the committee last night. Just to get the right one here. So it says here the Select Committee and other public accounts have revealed credible evidence of your involvement in the events within the scope of the committee's inquiry. You reportedly attended a December 18, 2020 meeting in the Oval Office, during which participants discussed seizing voting machines, declaring national emergency, and invoking certain national security emergency powers, and continuing to spread the message of the November 2020 elections had been tainted by widespread fraud. And he's did a lot of the stuff on Newsmax and elsewhere. But I'm really interested in your thoughts, Aaron, here on his involvement in the weeks leading up to all of this, in sort of fomenting this idea that the elections were full of fraud and deserved to be overturned by the state electors, or at least the state legislatures.
This is, I think, a really important point that I think we're going to learn a lot more about personally, because, in addition, it's interesting that you mentioned the seizing voting machines initiative that he was going for, because he wasn't only doing that on his own and working with his own close associates to do that. In fact, we learned a couple of months ago that he was also reaching out to some constitutional sheriffs, the Constitutional Sheriffs Peace Officers Association, specifically Sheriff Darleaf of Michigan, the guy who was seen on stage with some of the Whitmer kidnapping plot associates, right? Mm-hmm. And so Darleaf actually attempted to reach out to other constitutional sheriffs and recruit them to help him seize voting machines. And the information that he was using to do that is the same information that that Trump was passing out in DOJ to try to get DOJ to use to overturn the elections as well. And so it's really interesting that we've got sort of this multi-pronged, multifaceted approach going on here. Between I at a certain point I started agreeing with folks who referred to it as irregular warfare, because they were essentially waging attack through a legal system, through a political process. When all that failed, they went to more kinetic approaches essentially. But you can kind of see all this building up on the lead up to January 6th, right, all the way up until the famous Georgia call, the infamous Georgia call, right? Mm-hmm. And Flynn, interestingly, has some, and maybe we could save this for when we talk about Mr. Stern, but he interestingly has some folks around him that there are some indications might have been involved with all of those aspects, and potentially even before some of Trump's folks were. So it
certainly seems that's the case. I mean, you sort of have we certainly are aware of what is happening now for January 6th in terms of, getting the event done. We know that there were political movements going on behind the scenes in terms of convincing federal and state officials to vote against the election outcomes. But there's more. It seems like this group of people that Everett Stern identified were around Mike Flynn appeared to be a group of individuals belonging to one particular party. He's called them the Patriot Caucus, but who knows if that's the umbrella they're really operating up. But let's take that as the name, the Patriot Caucus. And if that's the case, you've got a group of people there who are not only involved in funding operations to try and convince state officials to overturn the votes, but maybe even using some dirty tricks. I mean, Stern's allegations last week, he didn't go into them in detail, but seemed to indicate that there were, even considerations of doing things like domestic terror acts, didn't elaborate, but against certain representatives in the House of Representatives. I mean, they're quite serious of the allegations, although he did not go into them in detail. Certainly that's the indication. And so you look at this group of people around him, around Flynn, that Stern identified here, Dave, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because it seems like a black op kind of thing. It looks like an operation with sinister motives and with sinister actions of trying to undermine democracy in a much more sinister way than has previously been described.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the first thing to kind of say is that, the information that Mr. Stern has provided has in general, seemed to be correct. The claims that he's made seem to check out in terms of times, dates, places, people, names, relationships, names of organizations and whatnot. There's evidence of everything that he's said, existing online. Now, I think that there are definitely open questions that people have about, what his motives are, and whether or not he may still be in some way working for this organization, or maybe otherwise trying to protect himself. And I decline to speculate on that. Basically, that we can't really judge that right now because we don't have enough information. But what we can do is simply judge the information that he's provided and see if it has utility. So, towards that end, he's provided the names of this, Velma Anne Ruth, Mark Still, Al Hartman, this real estate guy, and of course Ivan Raiklin, who's Flynn's longtime attorney and ops guy, and also this Rick Saccone and or Saccone, and all of these folks appear to be involved in various aspects of Pennsylvania politics. There's a group called the London Center for Policy and Research that some of these folks seem to be connected to. So Velma Anne Ruth is connected to a guy named Brigadier General Ernie Arduino, and he's got a background in like Kurdistan and Iraq, and they've got all seem to have connections into Egypt, and dealing with the Middle East. And so there's a lot of pro-Israel sentiment, very anti-Islamic sentiment, and some of that they come by honestly from U.S. foreign policy. It's not like that's a totally aberrant set of beliefs, but at the same time, it gives you a sense of what network that they're hooked into. And there's another group called the Gold Institute, run by a guy named Eli Gold, that's connected in with this network of folks, and with Arduino, so it's kind of just more pointers into the usual suspect network, and I think that this just underscores the need for gaining more information so that more could be understood about their activities. I will say also that when we talk about the constitutional sheriffs movement, that whole situation is not limited to January 6th. This is something that's been going on for some time, and is really the basis for the gripe that the Council for National Policy type people have with the federal government. And their basic idea is that they want to do this aggregation of local and state governments to oppose the federal government. And of course, they're also pushing, for the adoption of, like gold and silver as currency, and also now crypto as a way to reject the Fed coin, federal dollars, the money created by fiat and run by the Federal Reserve. So, this is bigger than January 6th. And that's one of the things that I think we're starting to understand, is that January 6th is actually giving us a little bit of a skeleton key to understanding, this much larger process and network, which is still active, and the process is still going on.
I think it's a very important point, is that, it didn't end on January 6th. It was maybe just another chapter, January 6th, because we still see the same
sort of a flare up of a condition, if you will.
Yeah. A worsening condition that we've not really dealt with. And so, when people, question about, why people being so critical of Merrick Garland not doing very much yet publicly to at least enforce some of the laws around these people, it's because of that. I mean, you sort of have a situation where we can all see that this is still ongoing. This is not something that ended on January 6th just because, Biden was installed as the president, rightly so. The sentiment continued, and certainly the activity continued. And now we can see from Stern's, allegations here that a lot of it is not above board. Potentially what Stern is saying here, if proven true, is that there's illegal activity going on. There's potentially blackmail, extortion, all sorts of things going on to pressure local officials to act in certain ways. And as we head into another election cycle where some of these election officials have been installed, and we have questions about whether they are legitimate as well, this is not something that we can just ignore. I mean, this is a current existing situation we have to deal with as we head into an election cycle that's just around the corner.
It's so current, Zev. that it just happened in Virginia. So one of the other things that Everett Stern had mentioned was that this wasn't just taking place in Pennsylvania, but that it was also in Oklahoma and Virginia. I think if you look, Ivan Raiklin was actually just in a video with Governor-elect Youngkin. And there was a lot of, voting that took place as a result of the CRT. A lot of people talking about critical race theory, not really truly understanding what it was, but knowing that it was bad, right? It wasn't something that I can describe to you, but it's something that I know I need to vote against.
Right.
So how did they get to that, mentality that, just by hearing any type of, wokeness, if you will, because I know that's another term that's being bandied about at this point, would be falling now into a singular category of critical race theory. And if that helped to propel Governor-elect Youngkin, it's an interesting video to see him kind of go up to Ivan Raiklin as a result of his election and say, "Hey, you're the greatest." I mean, it's a little weird.
I mean, it certainly feels like in Virginia, where Raiklin himself was standing for office as well and was eventually actually not allowed to run because there were so many issues with his campaign. But he's been running a pressure campaign there too. There's a lot of photos on his Instagram feed where he's going around to local officials. Clearly, some of them are not clearly, but they seem to be making comments that might be a little bit under duress, where they're describing their desire for an audit and re-looking at that vote in last year. It's very difficult to see that this guy's operating in good faith, considering his background. But before we leave this one slide, I think it's just important to get everyone's thoughts on it, and then we'll talk about Raiklin and Velma in great details. But I am interested, Aaron, in your thoughts about this network that Stern is identifying here, the one that has a real estate tycoon at the helm of it, a guy who is made a lot of money in Texas of real estate. You've got Flynn, we know his history, but you've also got these sort of former Marine in Raiklin who's also fluent in Russian, and all these other operatives that seem to be operating on the ground, which are either elected officials or soon to be elected officials. It's troubling when you look at that kind of a network of sort of bad actors.
It absolutely is. And, I concur with what Dave was saying just before me a second ago, that, I don't want to assess credibility or anything like that. We don't have enough information, but it is very interesting that he's surfaced a couple of folks that we haven't really spent much time digging into, that folks weren't really aware of. And then we go look, and there's some actual credible information behind that. So, that's certainly a point in his favor, because there's been a lot of reporting about Raiklin, especially from a researcher on Twitter, Vision Surreal, is basically, he's been way ahead of the curve on this part of the story, and so a lot of what Stern is talking about, it really correlates with the contours of what we already know around the Raiklin story, the Flynn story, some of these things, but then it adds this sort of extortion story on top of it, right? And I hope that DOJ and some other really smart folks are, investigating that and vetting it out. I'm not making any judgments about him. I come from a place that is skeptical due to the last several years that we've lived through, and the way I think a potential analogy to describe my skepticism would be the dossier, and the way that it came out and layered things on top of what we already knew, but then it added these really salacious claims that weren't really, maybe not provable, and it actually served as a way for people to discredit, call the entire thing a hoax, and undermine it. And I'm not saying that's what this is. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that's part of what informs my skepticism is those kinds of situations. 100%. So yeah,
I think you're right about being skeptical about I'm not skeptical about the allegations themselves. These allegations he's made, and the DOJ and others have to investigate it. I don't think we can say whether they're true or not. But what is interesting to me, aside from the allegations of extortion and blackmail, is the network, which is a new network that we hadn't seen before, even though we'd all been looking at this group of people we hadn't really identified the Patriot Caucus as a thing, and we hadn't identified Velma Anne Ruth as someone significant to look at. And Raiklin, as you point out, Vision Surreal has been doing some amazing work on that, but has not been front and center of our thinking around all these events that led up to January 6th. So aside from the extortion allegations and the blackmail allegations, we have learned quite a lot about this network, which I'm kind of fascinated about. It's also really interesting that soon after we aired that interview, both websites, it appears to me, the Patriot Caucus one and the one that Velma has, which is, sorry, let me find it. Both her own website, which was called, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading it here, but I will find it for you. What's the name of this website again? So her company's called ABS Community Research. Sorry, I apologize for that. So, both these sites went down. I don't know if they pulled them down, other people pulled them down, but all the information on it landed up being taken out. And one of the interesting things that were interesting to me of her website is that she has received an award with the United Nations affiliated organization, which also appears to be affiliated to the Moonies, which, for people who've been watching this show, is a bit of a red flag. We've done so much work around the Moonies and their involvement in Jan 6. So Dave, you've certainly been involved in some of that. As you, I know it's a peripheral affiliation that she has, but she was given an award by this UN organization that is affiliated with the Moonies. What are your thoughts about their involvement with these people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have to look at when you're studying these kinds of networks is the associations between them, their affiliations. There's the principle of homophily, which is sort of the tendency of people with like-minded views to, cluster together and to hang out together and whatnot. And I think one thing that people sort of get wrong when they're trying to study networks like this is, this isn't a criminal investigation here. We're not trying to prove that somebody is, guilty by association. It's more about what are their motives, what is the network that they're hanging out with, what are the probabilities of them being, sort of affiliated with a set of causes that might explain their behavior, so that we can understand what they're trying to do and what they might do next. So, for example, I'm very unlikely to get a certificate from an organization affiliated with the Moonies, because I don't really, hang out with those kinds of people doing those kinds of things. Right. But, somebody like Velma Anne Ruth appears to have been doing that and appears to be, aligned with networks that were pulling in the same direction, as it were. So I think, you have to be careful about how you talk about that kind of evidence, but I think it does indicate a certain worldview and propensity towards certain kinds of activity. And I think you just sort of take it at face value as it is.
Mm-hmm. Certainly interesting that the same organization, that same Moonies organization, was responsible for that big summit with Donald Trump recently.
On 9/11 20th anniversary,
of all dates.
And if you look historically, I mean, the Moonies were deeply involved in all of the anti-communist stuff in the post-war era, and then, tightly involved with the formation of the Council for National Policy and Iran-Contra. I mean, it's inextricable from the history that we're dealing with here.
100%. You mentioned another interesting connection to Egypt, and this is, she has a podcast, Velma Anne Ruth does, and it's fascinating listening to, if you want to journey through the mind of someone who's certainly got themselves very involved in an insurrectionist movement based on a lot of falsehoods, but nevertheless, there she is in these podcasts talking about all these crazy things. And amongst other things, she, on January 25th, just a few weeks after the insurrection, she's on a very personally directed message to Donald Trump, assuming, I guess she does, that he's listening to her podcast. It says, "Dear Sir, call General al-Sisi, the Egyptian leader, and by the simple suggestion, I would assume you know exactly what I mean. Secretary Pompeo would know everything about everything." I mean, I don't know if she has, if Donald Trump is a fan of her podcast or not, but it's the connection to al-Sisi is impossible to ignore because of his history supporting the Trump campaign back in 2016, but also just in general. Boy, it's a weird name to throw into the mix when you come around to January 6th.
Well, and Donald Trump called al-Sisi his favorite dictator a few years ago, and so there seems to be some connection between, this network, this Velma Anne Ruth and Audino and all those folks in installing LCC in 2013. That seems to be the implication. So,
Mhm.
and he's widely considered to be a dictator strongman type. Much like we've seen in other parts of the world that have affiliated with Trump and his network. So I think it just deserves a great deal of historical scrutiny, as well as looking for signs of potential wrongdoing and criminal activity.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in terms of recent history, if you go back, I don't want to go back into the Wayback Machine too far, but Volume 5, there's mention of LCC and Mike Flynn as well, as it relates to the UN and even a vote that was
Right.
coming up about the Israeli settlements. So there's
Yeah.
there's an awful lot to still learn from Volume 5 that was released years ago.
Absolutely. It does seem like this network has very big international connections, which brings us to Raiklin. Aaron, why don't you tell us a little bit more about who this guy is? He's certainly not your typical Pennsylvania politician. This is not that kind of guy.
Yeah, absolutely not. And so he's, former military, and we kind of have known for a bit that he was associated with Flynn, but we've recently learned a couple of other things about his recent history, and that in an interview that he did. I forget the outlet, the right-wing outlet that he was speaking with, but he did an interview where they identified him as being an employee of Flynn. So that was kind of a confirmation of the connection that we had seen, right?
Yeah.
But in addition to that, by the way, in that same interview, I thought it was interesting. I'm not sure how familiar folks are with Flynn's backstory. I think your viewers here are really aware of it, but and his kind of history with Russia and his strange affinity for them, and similar to Trump. And
Who among us
I
hasn't
thought it
had
was
dinner
interesting.
with Putin at an RT
Right.
conference? We've all been there.
Right.
Everyone's done that. Just $50,000.
Right. Well, I only got up as high as surgeon, the GRU director, so I didn't get to go to the
Well,
man.
there's something to aspire
It's not
to.
that important. Yeah. So, we see this history where Flynn starts kind of just basically repeating Russian talking points, like about NATO and things like that, same that Trump does. But it was interesting in this interview that Raiklin described Flynn's dissatisfaction with and departure from the Obama White House in an interesting way. The way he described it, and he's a family friend of Flynn's and an employee, right? So it's interesting to hear him say that Flynn essentially was upset that Obama was allowing folks in Afghanistan to run Russia out of the Middle East, to allow ISIS to run Russia out of the Middle East. He specifically said that, and that's what Flynn was upset about. And I thought that was really, really interesting, right? I mean, it kind of aligns with some other things. I'm not, this is Raiklin saying it on a right-wing talk show, so, grain of salt, but I thought it was really interesting, and it does align with some of the things we already knew about Flynn. But in addition to that,
it's certainly we shouldn't. Let's just pause here for a second and talk about Obama and Flynn. I mean, this is a really serious personal vendetta that Flynn has. I mean, it's not something that is generations old. It's something that happened between him and the former president of the United States, and it involved him being fired quite publicly for essentially losing it. I mean, that's the nice colloquial way of saying that, why he lost his position, but he apparently became really unstable in his job, and was fired by Obama, publicly, but was still allowed to sort of leave without, losing his pensions or whatever. So he got all of that. But it's certainly, you can't ignore that as you're looking at this. This is very personal for Flynn and his cohorts there.
it very much is. And
Well, I mean,
Flynn.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
Aaron,
No,
why don't
I
you
was
finish?
just going to say that in many ways, Flynn is like a disgruntled employee that also knows how to do network insurgency and psyops. Like it's the worst possible situation to have like a disgruntled employee with that skill set.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's a bigger story here around U.S. counterintelligence and how we manage people so as to prevent them becoming radicalized by third-party countries, as well as just being radicalized on their own. And, if you look at all of the different people that have been helping to, drive this set of maneuvers, so many of them are ex-intelligence and ex-military. And we have done a horrible, horrible job at protecting those people from becoming, radicalized and turned against the best interests of the country. So that's something that we need to figure out systemically here. And I think that's a very underlooked aspect of this situation.
I think you're right. I think it's, you look at the First Amendment Praetorians and their leadership there. There are a lot of disgruntled people from Afghanistan. The entire Flynn family is really, in charge of all of what's been going on, it seems, for operationally. And that's, the fact that it's his family that it's doing it, it just does feel like it's a very personal, but also a deeply disturbing thing that they were sucked into what seems to be a foreign psyop of some sort. It doesn't seem like this all comes from Afghanistan. It's all right there on the border. Okay.
Yeah, on the subject of Flynn's family, there's been a little bit of tension around this because his brother is now in charge of the U.S. Army Pacific Command, which is the largest Army command there is and has direct interface with China. And a misstep there or some kind of bad faith action could easily escalate into some kind of very unpleasant situation. And so when you look at Flynn's family and the fact that he's got several brothers and various other relationships, his wife and sister-in-law and all these people that are like all rooting for him and fighting like a Flynn. And then you've got Charles Flynn running the frickin' Army Pacific Command. It just raises questions. Now, it may well be that Charles Flynn is the only, good apple in the bunch, and he's aghast and appalled at all of this. But, the fact that he was in the room on January 6th when the decision was made at the Pentagon not to send National Guard troops for over 3 hours, and that the Army lied about that fact, it raises questions. So on the one hand, I don't intend to smear Charles Flynn's perfectly good Army career or his name, but, from a counterintelligence standpoint, this doesn't read very well. And certainly from an investigatory standpoint, you would want to have every possible assurance that he was in no way involved in this and is no way sympathetic to, his family's shared project, if you will.
Yeah, for a man who's concerned so much about optics, the optics of that certainly do not look great. And, this one post by Raiklin here, this is, I think, it's not from Twitter, it's from Parler or one of those other sort of right-wing versions of Twitter. In it, he's under the Flynn picture there, it says, the most respected general amongst patriots since George Washington. Traitors tremble in fear when his name is mentioned, Michael Flynn. And then it says, I wonder if he's going to come out of retirement. I mean, another sort of nod, not so subtle nod, to this idea that Flynn and his family, or Flynn himself, is going to be leading these patriots out into some sort of war, into some sort of civil disobedience, into I don't know what they're threatening with all this coded language. But it's not. It certainly doesn't indicate a peaceful insurrection or peaceful protest. These guys are armed and dangerous.
Absolutely, and it's
there's really.
Sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead.
Just to go back to the Raiklin connection in his recent history, because photos with him and connections to him are interesting because we also recently learned that, or at least according to one of his resumes, he was at DIA at the same time Flynn was. He actually started there in 2012.
Oh, really?
But continued there after Flynn left, and he was there until I could be wrong about this, but I want to say until 2018. That seems a little late, so that may not be right. But he was there well after Flynn had been fired. Still working at DIA. I'm not sure what his position was. This is, again, just based on a blurb and resume of his that we had found listed. But
not to read too much into him. Yeah. I mean, but, he does speak Russian fluently. Maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe that just happens because you're in that, line of work. But I don't know if his history is Russian. I'm not sure if his family's Russian. But
he was born in the Soviet Union, if I recall.
Okay. So there you go.
Yeah. And he crowdfunded an effort to create a movie about Putin that would kind of lionize Putin a little bit. So that was really interesting as well.
And a Green Beret here in the United States, and then you say now work to DIA. I mean, that's a pretty disturbing picture of some
security clearance,
right? Yeah, you're right. I didn't get that. But it's very troubling. I mean, this guy's close to people like Youngkin. He's getting Youngkin elected. He's running around. Doing campaign work for Youngkin, the new Virginia governor. He'll certainly be involved in every election going forward if he's allowed to. It looks like he could be maybe under the influence of a foreign country doing all these things, and so close to our political operation of the Republican Party. And if you don't pick that up, Joe?
Well, I think, it's interesting to think about foreign interference and things like that. But I wonder if it's somehow just merged back into Flynn has the tool set to do this. He has the paramilitary around him. He's got people who are following him that have, been through, irregular warfare techniques. Does it need to be foreign anymore at this point? Does it need to be just finding your own sort of divisiveness within the country and using those as wedge points?
I hear that a lot, and I have trouble with that because I do think it matters that there's a foreign involvement. I mean, certainly may not even exist if there wasn't foreign involvement. I understand that there's a lot of division in a country nevertheless, but I don't think these things organically flare up, or maybe they can, but I don't think they organically flare up. I think it's very easy to dismiss the foreign influence because it's meant to be hidden, and it is hidden quite well, but it certainly exists. I mean, to dismiss it or to ignore its impact is quite dangerous, I think, because I really don't know if this would be happening to America if Russia and China weren't actively working on, and others working on the periphery to foment this division.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't want you to think that I in any way am poo-pooing away the foreign, the foreign part of this, because absolutely without it, then none of this is occurring.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
No, I just wanted to add to that the history here is so clear in terms of the international alignment between this set of factions goes back decades and decades and decades, if not probably longer than even 100 years. It's the same network of factions. You've got right-wing factions in Europe. You've got right-wing and organized crime factions in Russia. Factions in China that are opposed to the Communist Party. And then you have this very clear, sort of anti-communist faction in the United States that's existed for decades and decades and decades and really hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, it's the business plot people, the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Legion, the John Birch Society, the Council for National Policy. It's the same people. It's just,
over and over and over again. Exactly.
But it's the same exact network of interests.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an international problem. And right now it's flaring up and, we've got to get the devil back down into the hole.
Exactly. It's interesting just buzzing up some things here about Raiklin. Here he is with Ben Carson at the White House Christmas party because everyone gets invited to the Christmas party by the Secretary of Urban Development and Housing. Up there at the top there, he sees a Russian wife. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but there you go. They both speak Russian and both have connections back to Russia. And then and this next one on the right is him basically running the political operation for Michael Flynn, where he's endorsing a candidate for the election on behalf of Michael Flynn. He's issuing these statements saying Michael Flynn endorses Tom Norton, whoever he may be. And this happens repeatedly throughout Raiklin's quite active Instagram and Twitter feeds. You get the sense that he's running the political wing of whatever Flynn is doing, and it's dangerous because it's obviously having an impact on a political level across the country. Aaron, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to hear Raiklin describe it in his own words, this same Twitter researcher has unearthed video of Raiklin, some video interviews of his where he is, in his own words, described his role in some of these processes. And it's very interesting that, for instance, after the election, he was casting about looking for ways to help and flew into Pennsylvania and started working with some of the attorneys there to try to find, ways to combat the election results and so forth. But then he said he stepped back and saw his role a little bit differently. And he said there are people who are working on individual legal aspects of this, but that wasn't his strength. And he basically said that, his strength is big picture. And then he went on to discuss the irregular warfare experience that he had in the military and to discuss the sort of this almost asymmetric warfare kind of approach that we've been seeing. And then in later videos, we actually see him describe multiple plans that they have in place, contingency plans and such, going through the legal strategy. And, he introduced Operation Pence Card on December 23rd, and Donald Trump retweeted him. So on December 23rd.
This is a really
He
important
described-
thing that you're describing here. So, Operations Pence card, like the former vice president's name is because they had various scenarios gamed out. Whether it was Eastman or Raiklin or together. It seems to me these might have been working together. They seem to be operating under very similar sort of ideas. That they were proposing different scenarios in which to keep Donald Trump in power. And one of them involved insurrection of January 6th. And then aspects of that involved something called the Pence card. So what was the Pence card specifically?
The Pence card is essentially exactly what we saw in the Eastman memo. And the Eastman memo essentially laid out specifically the process that he was using to pressure Mike Pence, and they essentially are saying that all the power is in Pence's hands, and that they have these obscure, constitutional remedies that allow Pence to take control of the process and send elector slates back to the states and have them, resend their own elector slates that would actually support Trump instead of the ones that they contested. This all hinged on states actually contesting their results, which thankfully did not happen because there were some people who care about democracy enough not to do that, Republicans and Democrats, thankfully on the state and local level, that kind of blocked that aspect. But if that aspect had happened, that would have been part of the plan. And so the Pence card operation was essentially describing Eastman's memo to, pressure, influence, and pressure Pence into refusing these various states' electors. And what's really interesting is that, as I said, Trump retweeted Raiklin's Pence card operation tweet on the 23rd. And then the very next day, he called Eastman when Eastman was on vacation and spoke with him at his family, home, wherever he was on vacation, and talked to him on Christmas Eve.
It does seem to me that all these things coincide. I mean, you can't sort of look at Raiklin and Flynn and then, the meeting that Flynn had with Sidney Powell at the White House on the 20th. These are all events on a timeline which coincide. For one operation, we saw the events of January 6th. We saw it happen in front of our eyes. And there's more to it. Obviously, it's still going on. But this is much more than just a bunch of Republican congressmen in the House not following the rule of law here. This is a big operation external from the representatives in the White House that involves many questionable characters, from Eastman to Giuliani to Sidney Powell to this Raiklin character, operating in illegal ways at many times. Certainly, it feels like a lot of the things that they might have been doing were illegal, and coercing and pressuring local officials to act in certain ways. It feels like we're in the middle of a mob type operation to force a political change in America through sort of organized criminal means. Dave?
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that, that's exactly really, what the evidence seems to point to. And I also just wanted to really briefly highlight that a lot of the activity that, this network has been pursuing seems to now be being pushed through the promotion of cryptocurrency.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of what went on with January 6th seems to have been tied in with this historical gripe over the gold standard, which, again, that's why I keep saying this goes back to 1933, 34, 1980. This keeps coming back up. And so now with all of this crazy buzz that you're seeing around crypto seems to be tied into the same set of operations. And, we've got the debt ceiling limit that's coming up on December 3rd. And, they seem to be curious about what would happen if we didn't raise the debt limit. I think ultimately they probably will, but there may be a lot of chaos that comes over the next few weeks as a result of that pressure to, see what happens if we don't.
Well, the one thing that worries me, to align to what you're saying here, is if you've got politicians under so much pressure, whether it's personal pressure, financial pressure, or just general pressure from their funders, who knows where it's coming from, but they're under so much pressure to behave in certain ways that they could do something that's very dangerous to the country, where normally these representatives might not operate in this way. But considering the tactics and the effect they've had so far, leading up to things like the insurrection, it could be that they do something dangerous, that we're still in a state of some sort of, conflict or war, where you've got, unbelievable pressure that's not allowing the normal course of democracy to proceed.
Yep. And, I think if you look back historically, this is exactly what Larry McDonald was talking about doing with Western Goals when he created that in 1980 as a private intelligence agency to use, any means necessary to gather dirt on Americans so as to be able to exert control over them.
Mhm.
And that's why something like Palantir is like the direct ideological successor to something like that. Now, who knows, what kind of dirt has been brought to bear on different people for different reasons. But I mean, that seems to fit the evidence based on what we've been seeing. And it certainly matches what, Mr. Stern was claiming in terms of, the desire and willingness to use intelligence to move people to specific outcomes. So I think, we kind of need to go under the assumption that we are under attack of this kind, and that the democracy is not exactly intact at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Really unstable, the situation we're in right now, and I think the tendency for everyone is to imagine that we're in everything's okay. Let's have arguments about the BBB and the infrastructure bill. I don't think that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing these global forces impacting our local politics to create this dysfunction and chaos that is far greater and far more significant than what's happening inside the Capitol, and more troubling because, we basically got a political party that potentially is being kept hostage. And I have no sympathy for the Republicans at this point, but I still feel like they could be under, the equivalent of a hostage situation where they've been held against their will to act in certain ways against their will.
I think we've seen this too, and I want to go back a little bit to the Eastman memo and the Pence card, because I think we have to take that along with the Jeffrey Bossert Clark letter. I think if we look at the letters that were going on between A.G. Rosen and Jeffrey Clark, he was basically saying, to the acting attorney general, you should really sign this letter because if you don't, I'll become attorney general. So there's a little bit of muscle, strong arming in that sense as well. And I think that the two things really need to work in concert with each other. I think if you look at point 1 of the Eastman memo, that kind of brings us into, well, what if Pence is unavailable? Well, okay, we knew that Pence potentially had the potential to be unavailable. We talked about that earlier. Secondly, they said that Chuck Grassley would be, as the Senate pro tem, what was the plan for him? Point 2 in the Eastman memo had to do with the slate of electors. And I think that goes directly to the Jeffrey Bossert Clark letters as well.
It is really interesting that they really have all these scenarios gamed out. And I don't believe that this is just the GOP in the House determining all of this. I think you've got a much bigger operation, as we've discussed today, that goes far wider than this. We only have a couple of minutes left, but Aaron, maybe you want to give us your thoughts here as we wrap the show on, and this is obviously just a first part of a much longer conversation and investigation into what really happened on that day. But what are your thoughts on today's content?
Absolutely. And so I think it's really important to be talking about this first off, because I think these are some of the contours of what we are going to see touched on. At least I hope so, because the evidence seems to indicate that this is, a part of the story that we all need to learn about, right? And based on what I've seen from the January 6th committee subpoenas, they're on track and they're looking in the right places, it seems like to me. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic there. I'm not someone who thinks that any of these investigations are going to make us 100% happy and, just, be, a dream come true with puppy dogs and rainbows. And, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be what everybody wants, but I have a really good feeling that they're looking in the right places at least. Right. Especially with as I said earlier, the distance that they're going back, the time frame that they're reaching back to in terms of looking for this information. So, overall, I'm hopeful. I am someone on the DOJ side and the Garland side. I'm someone who, I see things happening there, and while I am frustrated by lack of action on some fronts, I also know that if DOJ were the kind of DOJ that we want to have, we're pursuing all these investigations all the way to the top exactly the way that we want them to be, it would look exactly like it does right now, ideally.
Yeah. I'd like to see some action on Bannon. I must say that's taking a little time.
Well, that was my second part of that, is that I have to make an exception with Bannon and Flynn because I think what they're doing is dangerous. And they are still trying to incite a lot of things that need to be stopped.
Yeah, and certainly involved in our current politics every day. Aaron, this is everyone will have a chance to wrap up, but where can people find you on Twitter? It's at clearing_fog. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I created the clearing_fog account. It's just kind of, I try to be disciplined there and stay on message to the extent that I can, and try to, provide reasonable news with some, I think, some insightful takes, but without a lot of the extra.
It's a very good feed, and of course we should mention Vision Surreal, who's I can't remember his current handle, but it's at Vision Surreal is the Twitter handle. Everyone should check out his account too. It's very good. It's just very good, full of information regarding all of this. Joe, everyone can find you at Dempsey2, if I'm not mistaken, because I know I've got
That's
that
right.
wrong.
Dempsey2, TWO.
Okay. And Dave, I'm going to give you the last word here. As you see us going forward, firstly, people can find you at Dave Troy, DAVE Troy, TROY, and feel free to mention anything else you want to market. But where are we? Are we in a healthy spot, or are we still very much in the eye of the storm?
Well, I think from my perspective, the one thing that I feel a little bit of anxiety about is, like what Aaron mentioned about Bannon and Flynn. I mean, those two guys are really doing some dangerous stuff right now, and they're continuing to cause ongoing harm. And so I would really like to see something, happen with both of them soon, in terms of just curtailing their ability to incite violence and division. But that said, I do think that what Aaron said is right, that what we're seeing is pretty consistent with a DOJ that is behaving responsibly and paying attention to the rule of law and all of that. I am worried about the propaganda aspects of the fact that people feel like that the rule of law is eroding, and that standards are eroding, and that things really aren't being followed up on properly. And I think that can have a very demoralizing effect, that if these actors are allowed to continue, could be exploited to great effect. And so I think that in that manner, we're in a very precarious position right now. But I hope that the boat is listing a bit right now, but hopefully we'll see that corrected over the next few weeks, and people will start to feel a little bit more confidence in terms of how this is going to play out. But I also am really kind of glad to see that there is a little bit of awareness starting to develop around the history of this, and the fact that this isn't an isolated incident. It's not really about Trump per se. It's about libertarianism, and about the Kochs and the Mercers and their history with libertarianism, and the overall takeover of the Republican Party by the extreme right-wing libertarian movement that really got off the ground after World War II. So, I think that's all good context. And if people want to read more about, the stuff that I'm looking into, I'm really trying to look at that larger long-term history. So I do a weekly newsletter that folks can read at davetroy.medium.com, and you can sign up for a weekly email on that.
Which is also excellent. And I think your point is really valid. We have been talking in the Twitter, sphere for years now, almost, it seems, about what this is really all about, and the history and the context. And I remember having this conversation over a year ago about how dangerous an insurrection would look like, and what an insurrection movement would look like under Trump, and what would happen if the November elections weren't taken seriously. And almost all those things have happened without fail, because that is the way these movements take shape. So we've seen this in other parts of the world. We've seen how they work, and we're in the middle of it, maybe even in the early parts of it. If we don't act now, we run the risk of being in a very precarious situation. We still have our functioning democratic government, but it's being eroded every day. That Bannon and Flynn, Raiklin, all these people are running around in small ways and in big ways, disturbing the way democracy is meant to work. Because every time they do that, they take away someone's vote, they take away someone's voice, they install somebody who's going to be a problem down the line that may not seem so serious now, but next November, when we need that person to certify an election, and they've installed somebody who's corrupt, we're going to really feel the impact of that. So every day that these guys are allowed to continue this operation, certainly that Bannon and company and Flynn are allowed to continue operating in ways that we see and we don't see, is incredibly dangerous. So I hope everyone at home takes this to heart and continues to do the enormous work that they're doing everywhere in highlighting all of this. And I congratulate all the three of you for doing the same, because I think it is so important that people like you are out there taking note, making sure that people are aware, and that everyone else is amplifying that, and that it is good to see that various investigations are now looking at this very differently, certainly far differently than they were with a much narrower vision than they were on January 6th and around that time. People are beginning to see a much broader view of what's been happening, and I think that augurs well for the outcome of this investigation and the DOJ's. So on that note, thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you for being here on Narrative tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. We'll be talking about the Ghislaine Maxwell case. That'll be really interesting, plus a lot more. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good night. And thank you to you at home for supporting Narrative. We'll see you tomorrow night. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, Zeb.
Good night.
Night.
Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.